Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Ross, Director of the USC Casden Institute and Dean's Professor of History at USC. And on behalf of the Casden Institute and our partners at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy and the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israeli Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all today to our discussion. And today's event is the first of a two-part series that focuses on deadlock in Israel-Palestine, how to imagine a better future. And it features leading scholars, thinkers, and policymakers of different visions to reflect on the current impasse in Israel-Palestine and to share ideas and proposals for the future. The second part of this series will take place on Sunday, December 5th at 11 a.m. Please save that date, and I hope you'll join us again. For far too long, the gap between one and two state solutions has prevented a long overdue discussion of how to reimagine the conversations between two nations, both with legitimate roots and claims to the same land. It is our hope to shed light, not heat, on this topic that is generally avoided because of its polarizing nature. We hope to pioneer a new dialogue on how to deliver justice, equality, and peace to all inhabitants of the region. Because without, as I've told my 97-year-old Holocaust surviving mother several times, without being able to talk with those we may disagree, there is no hope for the future. And as I've said to her, if they can solve the problem in Ireland, we can solve the problems in Israel-Palestine. But right now, I would like to welcome my esteemed colleague and moderator of today's event, David Myers. David is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History and Director of the Ludwig Center for History and Policy. He previously served as Chair of the UCLA History Department and Director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. David has written extensively in the fields of modern Jewish history, and his numerous publications include Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, Between Arab and Jew, The Lost Voice of Simon Rodovitz, Jewish History, A Short Introduction, and his forthcoming American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, which he has co-written with Nomi Stolzenberg. In addition to his position at UCLA, David has taught at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and at the Russian State University for the Humanities. He's also been a three-time fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies in Philadelphia. More importantly, I'd like to acknowledge David has been the brains and moving force behind today's and next panel dealing with reimagining the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. It is my great pleasure to introduce David, who will in turn introduce today's panelists. David, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, for those very kind words of introduction. Really a great pleasure to be here with you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our Zoom audience that spans a 10-hour time difference from Tel Aviv to Los Angeles. On behalf of the Luskin and Nazarian Centers at UCLA and my colleagues Maya Ferdman and Professor Dov Waxman, it's not all that common for our two institutions, USC and UCLA, to join together. But today is a moment of harmonic convergence when the potential to amplify our impact in addressing major issues of our time is multiplied by cooperation. Now, our mandate at the Luskin Center is to study change in the past in order to bring change in the future. And that's why I was so pleased when Steve Ross and Lisa Ansell reached out to me to talk about a program dealing with Israel and Palestine. It seemed to us at the time that what was most urgent was to stimulate thinking about the future in the face of the stasis on the ground and really the paucity of political imagination. There are currently no peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Some say that the era of the two-state solution, which has been the dominant diplomatic and political paradigm for the last half century, is over. but there is no clarity or consensus about viable alternatives to it. Perhaps it can be revived, perhaps it cannot. And if not, what next? Will shrinking the conflict, as one of our future speakers, Dr. Micha Gutman, suggests, work or be sufficient? All of this brings us back to the age-old question, how can we imagine a political scheme that brings justice to the long-suffering Palestinian people and security to Israelis, whose fears extend back to the trauma of the Holocaust and beyond? The answer to this question will require investing time and energy in new paradigms to break out of the impasse. At the same time, it may also require revisiting the dustbin of history for discarded ideas that might offer us some escape from the stalemate. Our task today, and in the next event in this series on December 5th, is to think beyond the present to a better, more just, and sustainable future. We want to inspire political imagination in order to improve the lives of people on the ground in that contested land. It's a large task. It may be too grand or presumptuous, but we're about to try it now. It's our obligation to do so. We have with us today four outstanding thinkers and scholars to inaugurate the conversation. They represent a range of perspectives, by no means all perspectives that are out there. And we have a different roster of speakers, including Micha Gutman, in part 2 of this series on December 5th. So please do mark your calendars for that event. But let me now introduce our panelists for today, and I'll do so very briefly. Each of them will have up to 10 minutes and no more to assess where we are and, most importantly, where we should be going in laying out a vision of the future. After the four have completed their remarks, we'll have a bit of conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll move to Q&A, and I invite you to send along your questions by using the Q&A function in Zoom. We very much look forward to your input. So let's begin. I'll introduce all of our speakers in alphabetical order, which will be the order in which they'll speak. Our first presenter is Omar Rahman, who is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. And there he is writing a book on Palestinian fragmentation in the post-Oslo era. In December 2020, he wrote an influential paper on the confederal solution to the conflict called the State Plus Framework. Our next speaker is Dr. Dalia Scheindlin, who is one of Israel's leading pollsters, analysts, and political consultants. Dr. Scheindlin wrote her own influential paper on the idea of a confederation for the Century Foundation in February 2020. Then we will hear from Professor Yuli Tamir, who is a political philosopher, former deputy speaker of the Knesset, former Israeli cabinet minister, and currently president of Beit Berl College. Professor Tamir is one of the leading theorists in the world on liberal nationalism, as well as one of its most important advocates. In fact, Liberal Nationalism is the title of her 1993 book, on which she elaborated in 2019 with a second volume called Why Nationalism? And last, but certainly not least, we will hear from Shibli Telhami, who is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. He is one of the country's most important analysts on the Middle East, with particular expertise in surveying political opinion here and there, including the attitudes of Americans to the one and two state options. So welcome to all of our panelists, all four of you. Thank you for joining on this historic day when USC and UCLA joined together in collaboration. And I now invite Omar to begin our discussion.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you to Steve and David for inviting me to speak on this important panel. Let me preface my remarks by saying that it's important to recognize that there is a one-state reality in place today in Israel-Palestine. And understanding that context is important when imagining a viable political future. You can't impose a political solution in a vacuum. You have to contend with the reality as it exists. And the current one-state reality has institutional structures and vested interests and power dynamics in place that make it extremely difficult to upend and supplant with something else. It also has a trajectory that it's on, in which it's consolidating into a permanent system of ethnocratic domination. without even the pretense of a negotiated two-state solution being on the horizon or being of value or being a goal for the future. And if that goal still does exist, it's as the so-called state minus, that is the non-contiguous, non-sovereign entity that Palestinians are welcome to call state if they want, but is statehood really in name only. It's the Trump deal of the century. So I view the search for alternatives within that context, because obviously this is not an acceptable reality, and it's not a resolution of conflict. It's a recipe for indefinite conflict, because you can't keep a population subjugated and lacking basic human and political rights indefinitely. They will continue to fight against that subjugation, and the regime will continue to have to assert itself in the only way it's capable of, which is violently and fight for its survival, which is essentially what we witnessed happening in April and May of this year. So in one sense, it's important to continue asking, what is the optimal political arrangement for these two peoples living on the same piece of land, but who don't share the same language, culture, religion, historical narrative, or sense of national identity? Is it two separate states? Is it a single democratic state? Or are there other constitutional formulations that are more agreeable and more viable? In another important sense, I think it's vital to provide a realistic and workable alternative that can almost act as an off-ramp to the very dark future that I think we're hurtling toward. And that future doesn't just stop at apartheid, which is abhorrent enough, of course, but there is a real possibility of escalating into more catastrophic violence, mass expulsions, and the like. And we need to be cognizant of those possibilities and prevent them at all costs. So in my work, the State Plus framework, which was mentioned, I tried to analyze one type of alternative, which is the hybrid model of confederation, with those two things in mind. How does confederation stack up against other paradigms, namely two states and one state? And does it act as a possible off-ramp to prevent this conflict becoming an all or nothing existential choice for Israel, in which it either surrenders its 125-year-old national project and democratizes fully, or it feels compelled to resolve the demographic problem that it perceives by using its vast coercive power over the Palestinians? And I think on both accounts, confederation is in many ways a superior model for this time and place than its paradigmatic counterpart. And it's also an acceptable alternative to the status quo for, I think, the majority of Israelis, by offering a third choice in place of that existential binary, in which I think Israel is arguably more likely to use its coercive power than to democratize. I also very much care what's acceptable to the Palestinians, and not just what's acceptable, but what's aspirational. I never believed that strict partition was very favorable to the Palestinians. Many crucial elements of what they want, what they need, are disregarded by partition. So I think addressing those concerns in order to get people on board, limit spoilers, and most importantly, create a sustainable peace begins there. So let me make a brief argument on both accounts: confederation as a model and as an off-ramp, starting with the model. What I find compelling about confederation is that being a hybrid of one state and two states, and being inherently flexible, it allows the designers of the confederal framework to incorporate a lot of the positive elements of one and two state models and avoid many of the negative qualities. And there's no perfect equation there, of course, but I think a lot can be achieved. And I base my argument for confederation on three fundamental principles. One, that both peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, have the right to national self-determination, which can be fulfilled through statehood. Two, that the two sides are too intermingled and interdependent to separate neatly into distinct ethnically homogenous nation states, and undergoing a process of homogenization would require highly unethical and destructive methods, such as forced population transfer, which we've seen historically and negatively outweighs the presumed value of partition, in my opinion. And three, that both peoples have needs, aspirations, rights that are tied to the entirety of Israel-Palestine, and a paradigm that successfully applies concepts of shared sovereignty can mitigate the zero-sum competition that stems from those rival claims. So based on those principles, what I envisage for confederation is two states, Palestine and Israel, demarcated in their respective borders, with Jerusalem as an open shared capital. And they come together to establish a layer of joint institutions in order to share sovereignty over certain domains of mutual interest. And those two states can decide what these jurisdictions are, and they can include anything from environmental issues, water basin management, electricity and transportational grids, foreign affairs, trade, commerce, security, tourism, whatever. But the balance of power essentially remains with the individual states, and they have their own respective national governments and institutions. Citizens are able to maintain their group identities and collective self-determination, symbols, educational curricula, cultural institutions, whatever. There are two also concepts that I think are fundamental to making this confederation work for both parties. And those are open and soft borders and a system of permanent residency in which the political and voting rights are essentially decoupled from economic, social, residential, and property rights. And I believe what results from this framework, or what can result, is a framework that's more responsive to the needs and aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians. In that way, it becomes aspirational. It allows for the national self-determination of both peoples in a state of their own, allowing for expression and development in their unique identities and cultures. At the same time, it preserves the territorial integrity of the entire geography by keeping it accessible to everyone through extending rights to one another's citizens, preserving freedom of movement, allowing people to live, work, and worship wherever they want. And as a result, I think confederation has the potential to reduce zero-sum competition that previously impeded negotiations over final status issues like borders, settlements, refugees, et cetera. So in my paper, I do go section by section and lay out basic premises for confederal government in Israel-Palestine, foreign relations, citizenship, borders, refugees, and settlers. Obviously, we don't have time for that in 10 minutes. But as such, I frame the paper as a state plus framework because it's about expanding the rights and privileges of Palestinians and Israelis across the border of their individual states, rights that Israelis today enjoy exclusively at the expense of Palestinians. So I offer that framing in juxtaposition with the state minus, in which Palestinians are continually expected to kind of shrink their expectations in line with the reality that Israel is unilaterally imposing on the ground. And I was also striving to articulate a framework that liberates Palestinians at the outset, secures their human and political rights, creates a basis for cooperation, diffusing tensions, and fostering a common civic identity through power sharing. Now to the off-ramp. I consider this a possible off-ramp because at the moment, I think Israelis have very little incentive to change direction or abandon the reality as it exists. The interests of the state's Jewish citizens and elites are being well served. There's no accountability for the oppression that results from the system in place. The longer this reality persists and entrenches itself, I think the more that options for resolving the conflict peaceably down the road are going to narrow, and a negotiated resolution of the conflict becomes impossible. And so that's what we're trying to avoid. So I think the only option for overcoming these negative dynamics is to offer Israelis and Palestinians a compelling vision of the future that they can rally around in substantial numbers. And again, in the case of Israelis, I think at the moment, I don't see that happening voluntarily. In my estimation, you're never going to convince more than a handful of Israelis to give up what they currently have in exchange for a journey into the unknown, no matter how tempting or utopic it sounds. It's too risky to give up what you have in front of you for some entirely different reality. That's especially true of politicians in a democratic system in which they must be elected every few years. And no democratically elected official is going to take risky long-term decisions like uprooting settlers, pulling back the military occupation, creating a Palestinian state, when the choice of not doing so is easy, it's safe, it's lucrative in many cases. So I think that's not how democratically elected officials operate anywhere. I don't expect Israelis to behave differently. And that's why I think it's not just the two-state solution that's politically impossible today. No negotiated solution or resolution of this conflict is possible as long as Israel can function as it is indefinitely without accountability and without consequence. So I think ultimately significant amount of pressure would need to be mobilized before that calculus changes. However, again, I think pressure alone is not satisfactory. I think Israel is likely to become more adversarial, more reactionary, more reliant on its coercive capabilities if it's back to the wall. So I think you have to offer that compelling alternative that may not get people to voluntarily buy in, but is essentially compelling enough where when you're forced to choose between competing alternatives, that's where you're going to go. And you have to start building momentum and a broad coalition on the ground to get there. So when the time comes, you have a viable option. And again, finally, I think this fits ultimately within the current international consensus regarding two states. So winning converts internationally, confederation would hopefully be easier and will be a key part of the process for implementation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Omar, for kicking the conversation off. And I'm now going to turn to Dalia, and I just want to acknowledge that both she and Yuli Tamir are in the region itself, and it's by my count 9:19 in the evening. So we really appreciate your making time at this hour to be with us. Dalia.
Thank you. And I also want to echo Omar's appreciation for your including me in this event. I would like to, in a way, back up and look at where we are right now in terms of the current political analysis, although I assume it's not a surprise before I figure out where we can go. I think the critical point that probably everybody understands is that the critical actors here are convinced that there is no possibility right now, as Omar just said, of reaching a negotiated two-state solution, and that might even be dangerous to try. And when I say critical actors, I'm referring to leaders of both Israel and Palestine. I'm referring to the public on both sides, and I'm referring to that other critical actor, the US leadership. On both sides, the support for the two-state solution is currently only a minority. We haven't seen support breaking 50% on either side in about 2 years in my survey research. It depends a little bit on how you ask the question, but we're talking about basically the mid 30% to mid 40% range between Israelis and Palestinians, which is again the case for about the last few years. Just recently, our new Prime Minister Bennett went to Washington, told the president that he was going to work on what I might call interim issues. I don't love the terminology of shrinking the conflict, but the kinds of things that we see as interim steps, the only question is, are they going anywhere? But that refers to economic development, quality of life related issues. President Biden said, that sounds pretty good to me. It seems to me that what Bennett meant was that he doesn't have any intention of advancing an overall agreement at this point. And that's in fact what he himself insisted shortly after that visit, after there was a meeting with Gantz and Mahmoud Abbas. The next thing that happened, of course, was that the Prime Minister completely dropped the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the global agenda when he spoke at the UN. Israelis are frankly fine with that. It hasn't been high on the Israeli priority list anywhere near the top in a number of years. As for the Palestinian leadership, I think that theoretically the PA supports negotiations, but it lacks the legitimacy to undertake them. In most recent survey from my colleague, Dr. Khalil Shikaki at the Center for Policy and Survey Research, 78% want Mahmoud Abbas to resign. I'm not sure he even really wants negotiations, probably because he would face a coup for any concessions, simply because of the lack of legitimacy. So in that situation, I see limited options, but let's walk through them. One is to try, despite what I just said, to revive the two-state solution negotiations along the traditional lines, but it seems that it's hard to see that that would be a mission, bound for glory. The other option is to do nothing, which is what the Israeli governments have been doing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. At least that's what they call it. I would like to quote Carolina Landsman, a columnist at Haaretz, who wrote just a couple of days ago that doing nothing essentially means continuing, and I'm paraphrasing and translating, continuing a right-wing occupying, settling, annexing, and persecutionist status quo, my translation. So we have to understand that that's what the status quo or doing nothing means. In terms of annexation, it's an option. I think under the previous government, Netanyahu realized that annexation, or maybe he knew beforehand, is much easier once you scare the world into believing that you will have some sort of formalized annexation and then pull back from that brink so that everybody is relieved and you can continue quietly doing it on the ground. The other option is to work at present within the current circumstances to change the conditions on the ground in order to advance a future legitimate negotiations, in other words, leaders who can legitimately lead negotiations to advance a better political vision they might want to actually achieve. How to do that? Next part of what I'm going to try to argue. I think the first condition is that you need leadership on both sides capable of doing it. As a public opinion researcher, I do not think the public is going to lead this process. We have esteemed public opinion experts on this panel who will hopefully weigh in. But I think you need leaders who are both capable and committed to the idea of an agreed resolution, which is not the case today. Israel, for its part, needs to decide that its goal is to reach an agreed, negotiated political solution, overall resolution to the conflict. It's not what we have now. Palestinians need to develop legitimate leadership. And that means, if you ask me, through democratic elections. Democratic elections need a lot of steps to be put into place and a lot of overhaul of the current political culture in order to have real democratic elections. On both accounts, whether Israelis choose a leadership that is committed to a negotiated and agreed political settlement, and whether Palestinians can develop legitimate leadership through democratic elections, there are a lot of structural things that have to change, but it's largely a choice that those leaders have to make. And then I'd like to argue that in the future, when those conditions are ready, I would prefer for them to be sooner rather than later. There needs to be a better destination for where any kind of negotiations will go. I think that in my analysis, for some of the reasons Omar already pointed out, the old two-state solution based on a hard partition was not sufficient incentive for the two sides to make the compromises they would have had to make in order to get there. I think at this point, the fact that it wasn't achieved is proof that it wasn't sufficiently desirable. Omar has done me a great favor by making some of the case and also outlining some of the aspects of a two-state confederation. I'll just go through, maybe reiterate what I think are the really critical ones, so that even if we're repeating ourselves, I think people might be able to take away what's worth thinking about. One is that we're talking about two states. I don't think you can expect, nor should anybody expect, people with a national identity and national culture and national history to give up on national self-determination, unless that's something those people decide. So the idea of skipping over two states to something else, Israel already has its state. That would be a decision Palestinians have to make, and it's certainly not for me to decide, but I haven't seen any indication that the Palestinian identity is prepared to accept something that does not involve national self-determination in the form of some sort of state. And I think those two robust national identities need a territorial dimension. It would be nice to say we don't need that kind of thing anymore, that we're at the end of history, but it's not the case. The reality, however, is that even when you're talking about two territorial units, the reality is that the geographic, political, geopolitical, economic, environmental, epidemiological reality is that they will need to coordinate daily. That coordination needs to be organic, not an exception. It needs to be built in as a feature of how these societies will function. I think that is the basis for my conclusion, like Omar, that we need some joint institutions to help manage these things. A confederal structure just means there's more cooperation, certainly on the towering issues of security and economic policy. I think in terms of the security issue, I'd like to point out, to add to something Omar said, or maybe David said it, that Palestinians need a state and Israel needs security. Palestinians need security too. I don't think we should leave that out of the equation. Both sides need security. They will probably get it better if they coordinate in a tiny region. It involves greater movement flexibility across the borders, as Omar pointed out, soft or open borders, sharing Jerusalem rather than what I consider to be, frankly, a devastating idea of a hard partition in the middle of an urban environment, which would be devastating not only in an emotional sense, but in an economic in an economic sense and in the sense of urban living. I also don't think, frankly, that it's even possible, to be honest. And of course, allowing residency on the other side, irrespective of citizenship, for law-abiding people who accept the national sovereignty of the state where they're living, but retain their voting rights in the country of their citizenship and their national country. That is a kind of creative solution, or offers an alternative approach to two of the biggest problems in achieving the old two-state solution, which had to do with what to do with settlers and returning Palestinian refugees. It sounds, to some people still like a very remote concept, but it's not actually that different from the essentially confederated structure of the EU. So having tried to create an outline of where we are now, it's not a very hopeful environment, but I don't think anybody has the luxury to say, well, let's just stop imagining the future. If there ever are to be, we need to put the conditions into place to get to that future. But if we all kind of get behind the wheel and have no destination, or the wrong destination, that won't lead us to a better place. I think the confederal approach, my conclusion has been that it's not only possible, it may be the only realistic solution, more realistic than the two-state solution. But frankly, I'm not only talking as a political analyst, I think as a citizen of this region, it's the most hopeful possibility. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dalia, for your remarks. I just want to emphasize that this collaboration between USC and UCLA does not itself endorse any of these positions, including the idea of a confederation, which we've just heard about from both Omar and Dalia. But we thank you very much for putting this very interesting idea on the table, about which there are a good number of questions to be posed, which we'll get to. And I'm pleased now to invite Professor Yuli Tamir.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me to join this significant discussion. Following what has already been said, I think that the idea of a confederation, which is an interesting one, nevertheless demands that we go through a discussion about sovereignty and borders. So the very sensitive issues that actually disallow us now to even start a conversation are stable. And I find it very difficult to see how we can sort of leap ahead without going through the very tedious, maybe impossible process of creating two states and a confederation. Confederation is a wonderful solution to two states wanting to work together. But as long as you don't have defined sovereignty, Israel does not have defined borders, certainly not the Palestinian state, then we are not able to create a confederation. So for me, the confederation is an option for a future that is very, very far from where we are right now. Actually, I think the question is where we go from here, and I'm speaking about very small steps, not major ones, because I can't see anyone, neither on the Israeli nor the Palestinian, by the way, not even the American side, ready to take a courageous move ahead. Actually, since Oslo and Rabin's assassination, nothing happened. This is a very long deadlock. It's not like now there is a deadlock. I can hardly remember when there wasn't a deadlock. We're stuck. So there are two questions for me that are extremely important now. And then we'll see where we can go from there. The first one is the human rights issue. It's to stop the violence on the ground. It's not true that things have not deteriorated and we're just at a steady state in everyday life. It's true there's no solution, there hasn't been a solution, there hasn't been a solution on the table for a long, long time. But there has been growing violence of settlers in recent years, and certainly in the last 6 months, that should be stopped as an indication that Israel takes responsibility over each and every person living in the West Bank and Gaza. It's not a question of a political solution. We jump ahead towards a political solution, we forget the people on the ground. The people on the ground need help, and I think that is probably the most important issue. If you ask people what really matters to them, that is, for many, I think, a central issue that cannot be overlooked. The second question is whether the new situation within Israel regarding the empowerment of the Israeli Arab citizens will somehow influence the dialogue between Israel and Palestine. And that's, for me, is I don't, maybe Shibley will have an answer for me. I don't have one. We dreamt for many years that the Israeli Arabs will be a bridge between Israel and Palestine, that they will create some sort of a basis for a future dialogue of, that explores ways of living together. I think what we see now is an interesting and unexpected move, especially with the kind of government that we now have, that there is more of a voice to the Israeli Arab community. I am not sure where this community is going. I think one of the very interesting things that happened in the split between Mahmoud Abbas and the joint Harshima Mouchedet, they are what's the joint
Joint list.
Joint list. That the joint list seems to be weakening, but dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Abbas seems to be getting more and more power, but saying, I'm just worried about what is happening within Israel and forget all the other issues. So there is an open question here whether the Israeli Arab citizens could be recruited to influence also the way Israel behaves in the territories. And I think this could be a new player in the game. So unless we introduce a new player into the game, I can't really see anything changing. So if that player will start putting pressure, offering solutions, maybe promoting negotiations on even on a people-to-people level, something that has died out totally, right? There is no people-to-people cooperation anymore. Then we may be able to open new discussions, new venues of dialogue. If not, then there is no, I think, player in the region or outside the region that is interested in moving ahead. Unfortunately, the peace agreements that Netanyahu signed, that became very popular and important in Israel, actually are not taken as an evidence that peace is good or peace is possible, but it's taken as an evidence that peace without the Palestinian is good and beneficial to Israel. So there were moves that were wasted from the point of view of peace seekers that could have been promoting something more significant in the region. But if you go to the Gulf states, no one says anything about the Palestinians. So actually, there is lack of an interest in the problem, I think, all over the world, including Israel. And the only party now that can bring it back into the negotiation or even just the conversation are the Israeli Arab citizens. This is a huge burden because they have a lot of issues to deal with on their own, but I hardly see anyone else promoting a solution. This government indicates something very important that I think we have been dealing with for several years, but I think now it's very evident that Israelis are more interested in their internal affairs than in their external affairs. And even the big Iranian demon hardly recruits now votes. So this is not a very promising situation, certainly not a very optimistic conclusion, but maybe something that will change within the Israeli political scene will open up new questions and new opportunities for a new dialogue. And that will be a long one, a small one, and very far from a two states or a confederation, I'm afraid. Sorry for destroying the party.
No. That's why we brought you here, not to destroy the party, but to add your voice, of realism to the mix. I just want to remind the audience that you are welcome and invited to ask questions in the Q&A function. So please send along. We already have a growing queue. I encourage you to add to it. And we are now going to turn to Professor Shibli Telhami for our final opening presentation.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. And I'm really very pleased to join my friends and colleagues on this panel who preceded me with excellent presentations. I have to say that as for USC, UCLA cooperation, I did teach at USC a while ago, and we did have a cooperative relationship. We had actually a cooperative seminar. I had it with Leonard Binder at UCLA on the Middle East at that time. So it's not unprecedented, but you are right. It is quite rare, or has been, at least historically. Nonetheless, it's a pleasure to be hosted by both institutions. Let me just start by saying, Omar started with a really excellent presentation on what he called the one-state reality. And to put it up front, I have a co-edited volume coming out with both Dalia and Omar contributing to the volume. And the title of the volume, the working title of the volume is The One-State Reality. What is Israel-Palestine? We are all grappling with the same question. That is, what do we see now? Because do we call it occupation after more than a half a century? And most Palestinians, over 90% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza,
were born under occupation. Many were born and died under occupation. It's obviously a lifetime and no end in sight. So is that really an occupation? Or is it something else? Or what does it mean? And I want to, in some ways, argue that there are reasons why it's so difficult both to state what we're facing and to imagine where it's going, and why a lot of people are pessimistic about the outcome. Let me start by the outcome of a poll we've just done among scholars of the Middle East. I do something with Mark Lynch at George Washington University called the Middle East Barometer, the Middle East Scholar Barometer, where we poll scholars of the Middle East, political scientists who focus on the Middle East, who are members of the American Political Science Association, as well as members of the Middle East Studies Association. And we just ran a couple of them over the past 6 months. And the most recent one we just released a few weeks ago. One of the question was about what it is, just recognizing the prospects of a two-state solution. And what we found in the most recent poll that was conducted in July and August is that August and September, sorry, that what we found was that basically 57% of all scholars of the Middle East, most of them American, the overwhelming majority is American scholars who focus on the Middle East, say that it's too late for the two-state solution is no longer possible. And only the 40% who say it is possible say it's not possible in the next 10 years. So clearly people are pessimistic and growing pessimistic by the day. This was a 5% increase just from February when we ran another poll, and it were only 52% who said it's not possible anymore. So pessimism is pervasive about the prospects of two states. And more importantly, when you ask, so what is it that we have now? How would you describe the reality? Is it occupation? It's one state with inequality. Is it one state reality akin to apartheid? One state reality that's not akin to apartheid? What we found in the most recent poll is 65% of scholars who focused on these issues say that it's a one-state reality akin to apartheid. And part of the thing I think is that you have to keep in mind that if you make the leap of saying what we now face is a one-state reality, as Omar started, then it's really not hard to go to the next level and say it is akin to apartheid. Because the only thing that's keeping people away from saying it's akin to apartheid is that they're not recognizing it's a one-state reality. So if you make the move that it's one-state reality, not just occupation, and therefore inequality as one might expect under occupation, then obviously an increasing number of people will say it's apartheid. We've seen that among scholars, but we've also seen that in the past 6 months in two major human rights organizations, B'Tselem in Israel, and then Human Rights Watch in the United States, which probably even influenced the scholars' opinion. Obviously, the Gaza war in between February and the recent poll also had an impact. So the reality as recognized by scholars is along these lines. But think about the next question that we ask and how one might interpret that. So if you then you say, what if two-state is not possible or is going to become impossible? Then what is likely to replace it? And here is an interesting answer that again might take us into a different kind of calculus, which is then you find 80% of scholars say the likely outcome if there's no two-state is a one-state reality akin to apartheid. So very few people think it would be one state with equality, only 3%. 2% only think it'd be a confederation. So if you take two states out of the table, then the overwhelming majority, 80%, say it would be a one-state reality akin to apartheid. And that takes me into a place of thinking this way, which is whatever reality you recognize now, let's say it's a one-state reality, isn't really a prescription for where we're likely to go, where we should go, or a description of where we're likely to go. Those two are independent. And one might argue that if you start with a one-state reality recognition, which then pushes for more rights and more equality for both Israelis and Palestinians, in fact, it might actually push the two-state reality the two-state prospect a little bit more to the forefront, because there are a lot of people who don't like being labeled apartheid, and a lot of people who worry about the possibility of full equality of Israelis and Palestinians, particularly in Israel. So the outcome is separate from recognition of the reality, and I think that we have to start there. The problem with the one-state reality recognition is that the same as when you ask the question, what do you recommend? What is optimal? What is likely to happen that's reasonably fair? Obviously, in the past, you've had really only two possible outcomes. One is two states and one is one state with full equality. Still, I think from the point of view of the moral dimension, probably the only two that would meet that criterion. But even if you're pushing something, if you're recommending policy toward an outcome, who are you recommending to? Who are the stakeholder? Yuli correctly raised the question about the confederation in terms of can you even get to confederation without going through two states? In part because who are you recommending to? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the ones who are going to move it forward? Who are the ones who are going to make it happen? Because the international community, as well as the players, the Palestine National Movement, in this case also the Palestinian Authority, Israel as a state, these are the ones who are going to carry on with the policies. Who are you recommending to? Are you recommending to the UN as what? Are you recommending to the US, to the West? Are you recommending to the Arab states? Are you recommending to the Israeli government and the Palestinian people? It's very hard to envision recommending a confederation in that kind of context to people who are stakeholders who will make it go forward. And I think that part of the dilemma that we face in people abandoning, calling what we now have a one-state reality, is that the international community is very much worked toward the two-state solution, not just theoretically, but you have the UN resolutions. We understand what occupation is. We understand what the recommendations are of UN resolutions. The Arab states, when you look at the position of the Arab states, it's a two-state solution. American foreign policy, except for Trump, has been two-state solution. So if you take that out of that language, they don't know where to go. And on the American side, there's an additional dilemma. And that additional dilemma is the following, that if you look at the polling, particularly among Americans on Israel-Palestine, when you ask people, in the absence of two states, what would you prefer? Would you prefer a democratic Israel with full equality between between Jews and non-Jews, even if it meant that Israel ceases to be a Jewish state, or a Jewish state where there's inequality between Jews and non-Jews? 2/3 of Americans say they prefer a democratic state, even if it means that Israel is no longer a Jewish state. And that certainly is an overwhelming majority of Democrats, but also a majority of Republicans and independents. And for that reason, if you're an American politician, if you acknowledge that two states are not possible, it's very hard for you to take a position that is not for one state with full equality, which means obviously abandoning the Jewishness of Israel, which politicians find it extremely hard, and American political elite find it extremely hard to do for a variety of reasons. And for that reason, it's very hard for them to abandon the idea that we're still under occupation, and what we have is a state of occupation, that the inequality is temporary, and therefore we headed toward a two-state. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with who are we recommending to? For me, as a scholar or somebody who's interested in advancing a fair peace between Israel and the Palestinians, I would say, for now, I think we cannot escape recognizing that we have is very much akin to one-state reality. Whatever the outcome is, it may be still two states down the road, because those scholars that I talked about earlier, even the ones who were pessimistic, 40% of them still said two states are possible, but not in the next 10 years. But if two states are not possible, 80% of them say it's not going to be one state, it's going to be it's going to be one state, but it'll be akin to apartheid, not one state with equality. So the two states in their mind is still the most probable outcome, with all their pessimism. That is still the most probable outcome, but that should be detached from recognizing what we now have on the ground. And the reason for it is that morally, what we now face is unacceptable. And if we play this detached game of ignoring the horribly immoral inequity that now exists and not starting with that reality and pushing for equality now, and let the politicians figure out where you want to go with the outcome, I think we would not be doing our jobs.
Thank you very much, Professor Telhami, for your remarks and for beginning with a reminder about an earlier era of cooperation between UCLA and USC, of which you were part. So we are now going to bring all the panelists onto the screen, and we'll have a conversation, the five of us, for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to the questions that have been flowing in from you, the audience, and thank you for that. Please feel free to add to the list. I want to begin with a kind of large philosophical question directed to Yuli Tamir, which really is embodied in the title of your 2019 book, Why Nationalism? And the question is, what do you think is the state of play with nationalism today? Especially as we have passed through this highly turbulent era of xenophobic, ethnocentric, illiberal forms of nationalism. Is the model of sort of nation-state nationalism from the 19th century and in the aftermath of the First World War still viable? And what does it look like? And what does it look like to you when you contemplate Israeli nationalism?
But I think it's more relevant than ever. Even in our own conversation, we started from national self-determination, talking about sovereignty and statehood. This is not only the case in Israel and Palestine, where the region is an issue of defining new borders or new kinds of sovereignty. I think all over the world, questions of sovereignty, of immigration, of borders are still relevant, as are national health services and national education services. The state hasn't gone away. All those people who thought that globalization will make the state weaker, I think find it, and the corona made it very clear, that states in general are becoming stronger. Even though the pandemic is global, the solutions are local. Now, climate change will teach us, I think, the same lesson. The problem is global, you need cooperation, but you need cooperation of states. And that's actually what I said about creating Israeli-Palestinian collaboration of some sort. First, you need a state, and you need to be secure in your own self-definition. Then you can go further and create all sorts of alliances. But it can't be the other way around. First, you have an alliance, then you have a state. So the statehood is, and the nation state is still very important. Unfortunately, I agree with Shibley, and I think we're having a discussion on the 2 or 3% that might happen, not on the 98% of how to make the first move, which is the only relevant question right now. The end solution, unfortunately, in my mind, is so distant that it's less, maybe less important to put it on the table, because actually, while talking on the end solution, we prevent even discussions on steps towards managing the conflict. We talked a lot about solution, and I would like to bring us back to the state of managing the conflict because it's not going to go away.
Even as a political philosopher who spends time thinking about the ultimate good that we can and should derive, in this case, you feel we have to sort of put aside the aspirational and really focus on the realist perspective.
No, it's not. The aspirations are there and they direct our day-to-day actions. It's not that like we, do everything that we can do without having a moral, compass. But I think we can't just leap ahead, as I said. We have to decide what we do next. And what we do next is very far from creating a confederation or a state. It's about thinking really of how to think about the interim stages of from where we are now to some maybe future solution. And those are, I mean, if we conclude by saying, okay, Israel is a one state and apartheid or a confederation, okay, so if that's the reality and it can't change, then this is why many people left the peace camp, because they say, okay, that's the reality. There's no other solution. It can't, let's do something else. So for me, the question is really about justice, interim justice on the way to some solutions rather than just what's the end solution.
Okay, thank you. And I want to sort of pick up on that idea of interim justice by noting what seems to be a paradox in the current situation and in the presentations that we've heard, which is a number of you spoke of the unsustainability of the situation. At the same time that you noted that there's very little engagement with the world in the Palestinian question and Israel-Palestine in general. So how do we square these two pieces? And in a certain sense, how do we realign pieces such that there would be engagement in order to overcome a situation that some of you have described as unsustainable? Here, I suppose, a symptom of this paradox is the focus of attention on the Abraham Accords, which has been, at one level, a significant diplomatic breakthrough, but at another level, a diplomatic engagement that has drawn attention away from the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine. So I wonder how you think about this current moment of unsustainability and a big yawn on the part of much of the world about this question.
May I take this? Did you address it to a specific person?
I didn't. I see Shibley and then Dalia.
I like what the term Yuli used, call it interim justice. She didn't say interim arrangement. She didn't say interim economic arrangement. She didn't say an interim political arrangement. She said interim justice, because I think at this point, that's really what we could focus on. Meaning justice should be driving, because to the extent that we say this is not sustainable, of course, it is potentially a headache for governments, but it is because the severe inequality that now exists, as some people are calling apartheid, that needs to be addressed. And so even regardless of whatever political structure ultimately emerges and what we advocate and what emerges on its own, or how we move forward politically, that has to be the driving force. And then I think that has its own dynamics. Once you focus on the justice, even in interim fashion, and recognize that what we have is just not sustainable from that point of view, I think you can move forward. But I have to say, David, I mean, with regard to this measurement of justice, obviously we're talking about universal values, and I think that's what Yuli is talking about. Things that we all accept about each other, the international community, international law, norms, human rights, and so forth. But I think one of the things that Steve started with is taken often for granted, which I think needs to be unpacked, because we need to figure out what that justice means. Steve said at the beginning, both sides have, quote, legitimate claims to the same land. Now, of course, every side considers its claims to be legitimate. But I think if we're looking at the West Bank specifically, from the international community point of view, both sides do not have equally legitimate claims. Of course not. The international community recognizes the West Bank as occupied territory. And Israel does not have the same claim to the West Bank, and biblical narrative is not going to be a substitute for international standards of legitimacy. Now, each one can feel truly legitimate about its claims, but that's not the standard that we should apply when we're thinking about the claims. I think it's a completely different thing. And the legitimacy of Israel is not because of the Bible. The legitimacy of Israel because Israel is a state that has been recognized by the international community and has been accepted to the United Nations, just like Kuwait, which didn't exist, is legitimate because it's accepted by the international community, or the UAE is legitimate because accepted by the international community. So the legitimacy of states, and when with reference, or when we talk about justice, the reference has to be in terms of universally accepted norms, rather than on how each side feels. I don't say that we should ignore what each side feels. Of course not, because these aspirations are important. Sometimes you have to fight for them, or you feel you have to fight for them. And we have to recognize, let's say, the importance of religion, which is obviously something that we have to take into account when to analyze it. But when we're making judgment on the outside or using language, I think it's really important for us to keep focused on the international norms as the basis of judgment.
Thank you. Dalia?
Thank you. In answering that question, I have a lot of other points that I would like to try to address, but let me stick to a few. For the record, I don't think I ever said that this was an insustainable situation. I think political reality has showed its true face over many decades. Anybody who seriously says it's not sustainable for Israel simply hasn't been watching. It is sustainable for Israel. And so on Israel's side, the question is, does Israel make a decision that it wants to reach eventually? That compass, as Yuli put it, so that, of a final status agreed political resolution. I'm not even talking about which kind right now. Let's say 1 state, 2 state, 3 state, whatever. But I think there's been a decision in Israel in recent years that Israel does not want that. It wants unilateral action. It does not want to give up it doesn't want to see independent Palestinian statehood. That decision about whether Israel changes its course is ultimately an internal decision. Because Israel does have the luxury of continuing with the Netanyahu/Bennett approach that we see so far. How does that change internally? I mean, we can talk about external pressure. I don't want to take that off the table, but I also don't think that it can ever be enough. Between the cliche of we can't want it more than the parties, I don't believe that external pressure will completely change Israel's course on its own for a number of reasons we don't have time to get into, but practically, I don't think it will happen. Public opinion is important in that sense, right? We have to get somehow the public to be behind a change of leadership, but even that's going to be a very slow process. I think it has to be a decision, probably a dialogue of the political elites and the public. On the other hand, it's not sustainable for the Palestinians. When we say, is the situation sustainable? I think we have to analyze everything that happens in this region as both populations. There's too much talk about what Israel wants as the kind of end game of what will be. We have 2 societies living here, and it's not sustainable for Palestinians. I think that leads us to the question of what do we do now? And to try to answer briefly Shibley's point that we can't sort of advocate a confederation approach without first going through 2 states. I mean, fundamentally, I agree. Confederation is based on 2 states. But what I'm talking about is leaving behind the formulation of 2 states that was developed over 20 years ago now, and that was never reached agreement because the 2 sides didn't agree on the terms. Just to give you the one example that I started with, if somebody, I have given a lot of thought to how you actually divide Jerusalem on the ground. I'm not the only one. I've just drawn on the best work, the best policy work that I've seen done by the people who were working on the negotiations. And I don't see how you can do it. Not now. Maybe then with some not a little disruption. But now I don't see it as possible at all. And pretty similar for the border issue. Never mind the settlement issue. The numbers of settlers have grown. We're not going to get first a Camp David 2000 style hard partition the way it was outlined in the Clinton Geneva Taba frameworks. before we get to a confederation. The process of getting there is too disruptive, and it will take years to implement, even if it was agreed upon tomorrow. So how then do we look at two states? I would say invest everything we can. We already have one state. Everybody agrees on that. It's a matter of what it controls and how it controls. How do we get to the second state? That means that Palestine has to be more of a functioning state, and I'm going to revert to absolute political science-y wonky talk. It has to have stronger institutions. It has to have essentially, eventually and essentially free and fair elections, which is not something that will happen tomorrow. It requires an overhaul of the political culture, but it also requires both Israel and the PA to allow a free political culture, actual political competition, to be prepared so that when elections come around, they are competitive. It needs any number of policy steps for Israel to free up the Palestinian economy, allow greater freedom of movement from Gaza. You can ask Professor Goodman, who will be speaking to you about all those steps. The question is what those steps are intended eventually to accomplish. And I think they should be, I don't know if I would say I differ terribly from Micha Goodman's interim steps. The question is where they're going. I think they should be going to building what counts as actual capacity for sovereignty of the Palestinian state. And then they can enter into whatever arrangement they decide, whether it's a hard partition or confederation or something else. I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe we'll ask Omar to weigh in. I guess I'm interested in a couple of things. Do you regard the status quo as unsustainable? And your criterion of the off-ramp, what is it that will incentivize Israelis to effectively cede some measure of power to buy into the confederal arrangement?
Sure. I think one of the issues with answering a question last is that the people in front of you usually answer it first, and they did. And I think Dalia, especially, obviously, we share similar opinions on confederation. And I think she did a good job there of answering that. And it's also the sustainability issue. Like I never said that the conflict itself is not sustainable. In fact, a lot of what I said alluded to or insinuated that it is sustainable, that there's no pressure being faced right now for the type of oppression that this system perpetuates. And so, until that changes, then the sustainability factor will remain in place, I think. But it's not acceptable. It's not an acceptable reality. It's unjust, and that needs to change. It also is not the one state reality is not a resolution of conflict, is the other thing I said, because there are a lot of triumphalists out there in the public that claim it is, that the Palestinians need to basically surrender. I mean, that's real terminology used by, Danny Danon and Israeli politicians, that the Palestinians essentially need to accept their fate and surrender, and that's an end of conflict. But when you dig into their point of view on that subject, I mean, it's quite a ridiculous argument, because you can't you can't expect a people of millions to accept perpetual subjugation without rights indefinitely. It just won't happen. I mean, people will continually rise up. You can cow them for a generation, you can co-opt their leadership, but every new generation will, continue to look around and say, why am I living like this when everybody else in the world lives differently? And I can see Israelis next to me living differently. And so I think it will continue to be a recipe for conflict. Regarding the off-ramp, again, I think there's no incentive currently for Israelis to change or to abandon the status quo. The only thing that's changing that is actually the unilateral effort to annex or to push in a different direction, or the change of international perception regarding what the one-state reality ultimately is. Is it apartheid? And if that becomes a normative position from the international community, then things change, right? Even if there is no dramatic change in terms of the gradual movement that's happening on the ground. So things can change that way. But I think ultimately, in order to get Israelis to change their perspective on this and their acceptance of the status quo as perfectly reasonable, and again, there's the Palestinian side of things too, and I agree that the Palestinian politics is completely dysfunctional right now. And if you read my paper, I go into that there needs to be a lot of work done on the Palestinian side. I think I can quibble with Dalia a little bit on what she said regarding that on the overhaul, but definitely a lot needs to be done. But when it comes to the Israelis, I think there needs to be a mobilization of pressure, but at the same time, immobilization for a different future on the ground that way, and in the work that we're doing as scholars in terms of trying to conceive of a different reality. I think those things need to happen simultaneously. I completely agree with what Yuli said, that there is a justice issue on the ground. And even if we can accept the fact that we're not, a year out from a negotiated resolution of this conflict, that's not a reason to abandon the lack of human rights and political rights on the ground. I mean, Palestinians, what they're being denied is, even under occupation, is guaranteed to them under international law, basic human rights, that they should be granted by an occupying power. So the Palestinians, the international community needs to demand the application of those rights to the Palestinians, even if we're not at the stage of negotiations or of nearing an end of term conflict. And that was actually one of the problems with Oslo and with the peace process, is it said, well, let's just negotiate, and that acted as a distraction for the fact that in reality, on the ground, these people lack basic human rights and have their rights violated on a daily basis. And so that needs to change.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open up to the questions from the audience. And in a certain sense, it's the $1 million question about the idea of a confederation, which is a concrete idea that at least two of our panelists have put forward on the table, and is based on the idea that there are two states and some confederation between them. So maybe you can tell us, and this is something that has come up in the Q&A section, what are the confederal functions of this entity? That is, what are the shared functions of this confederation that stand apart from the independent functions of each of the two states? One person in the audience asks, would there be a shared army, for example? So I wonder if you could take just a few minutes to sketch out what you propose as sort of the confederal functions of this arrangement, and what the benefits of it would be over against having two distinct states without a confederate arrangement. So maybe we'll start with Omar and then move to Dalia and then open up.
Sure, I'll try to be quick. And I really recommend, if you want to read my paper or read Dalia's paper, there's some excellent work out there on a confederation. Again, my paper is also not a very detailed layout of it. It's a substantial paper, and it goes into kind of the rationale on a lot of these issues. But essentially it leaves on what you brought up in the question, it leaves that up to the states to decide what's of mutual interest here, what can we agree on working on. And again, that can be anything from water basin management, environmental issues. It can be foreign policy, it can be security, and all those things. And there needs to be elements of that, I think, in any arrangement. But one of the things I see as key is the open or soft border issue and the permanent residency issue. I think those things need to be established for this to benefit both sides in a way that makes it desirable and aspirational. Regarding an army, I get into the security issue in some depth, obviously not completely fleshed out. And I rely on some of the work that was done under the Obama administration by General John Allen and by the Center for New American Security. And they were looking at it from the perspective of two states in terms of, how can you come up with a workable security arrangement between two independent states here? And what I tried to do, and I spoke to the principles of all those studies and tried to make it work for confederation, and I think it does. And that was their opinion as well, that actually confederation in many ways accentuates what you can achieve on the security cooperation level. But I think you can come together in certain ways on these issues. It can be a very thick level of joint institutions that work on all these issues, or it can be fairly thin, as long as you can cover some of the most important bases in making an arrangement work. And again, I think this can develop over time. You can become more integrated over time. It doesn't need to start off with a very robust confederation with joint institutions.
Dalia?
Yeah, I think I'll partially reiterate, but let me also make a little plug for another group that's done a lot of thinking about this in the region called Land for All. Used to be called Two States, One Homeland. Just for anybody who's interested to get a sense of who's engaged in this issue on the ground and what they've been doing. And I think that we I overlap a lot. We've been involved with each other since the beginning. We overlap a lot in terms of how I think about this. So just to clarify, we're not talking about a shared government. And the reason I say that is because there are lots of people talking about hybrid solutions, federation, confederation, a lot of confusion, and maybe not confusion, but different visions about what they mean. There are some people who talk about confederation, and by that they mean a shared executive or a meta layer of shared government. When I'm talking about confederation, I mean two separate governments, two separate parliaments. We're not talking about joint lawmaking. At the same time, I think the key areas for coordination, to my mind, they're more. I think the definition, rather than an option, is first of all security. I mean, Israel. I actually do realistically think that the two sides should be thinking about how to get there. And I think that the only realistic approach is to imagine this as coordinated security, not a joint army necessarily, although, as who knows, I'm not going to say what would happen in 50 years. And right now the power imbalance is enormous, but there have been significant plans already worked out, for example, for what to do on Israel, on the eastern edges of the region, right? Like the Jordan Valley primarily, that were worked out in the event or eventuality of a two-state solution that involved some sort of transition from Israeli forces to international forces while they're training Palestinian forces, leading eventually to a joint Israeli-Palestinian force without the internationals over phases. These are plans that security people have worked out, and they don't even differ terribly from some of the two-state plans, just that when you were talking about two states as if they were completely separate, it didn't sound like real sovereignty for the Palestinians. This is understood from the beginning to be a matter of shared sovereignty. The two sides would have to agree on that, and if they don't, it won't happen. Shared economic policymaking. Again, it doesn't mean all economic arms have to be shared, but I would imagine a shared central bank. I think right now the Palestinian economy is so dependent on Israel. In any case, there's only one currency in the region. Again, the imbalance, the asymmetry is very severe. That's one of the reasons I think that there really has to be a strong investment in, again, Palestinian state building, including freeing up the economy, which is largely, controlled by Israel in terms of import-export, trade relations, et cetera. Omar, I would be more than happy to hear where you disagree on the internal Palestinian issues, of course. But I think that economic areas have to be a strong part of the cooperation. The other area of joint institutions that I think Land for All, the local movement advocating this, has done more thinking about, and they're a little more committed to. I kind of see this as something like Omar said, can go either way, but is a joint court of human rights. And it does make sense because you're going to have minorities of each national group living on the other side. They have to be protected by some shared standard. Who adjudicates that shared standard? So some would propose a joint court of human rights specifically for minority protection on both sides. And naturally, I would say it should be, kind of the most obvious to agree on joint institutions for natural resource management, environment, climate related issues, and public health.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions from the audience, one of which asked about the term occupation and whether it is a viable and legitimate term to use, given that there was never an Arab-Palestinian state. So asked the questioner. And I'm going to turn to Yuli and ask you, how do you understand the term occupation, which in some sense has sort of disappeared after making a very fleeting appearance in Israeli political culture? And there seems to be kind of a routinization to the presence of substantial numbers of Israeli citizens in the West Bank. So how important is this term as a catalyst to change?
I think it's a very important concept, but the more important concept is to understand that the 67 border, the border before 67 was an agreed, internationally agreed upon border. And after 67, Israel lost the legitimacy of its own borders. So presently, and this is something most Israelis don't acknowledge, that the territorial question is still open internationally. Most Israelis that were actually born after 67 take it as a fact that Israel controlled the whole region. So the term occupation, whether legally it's the proper term or not, is important because it distinguishes between two territories. Now, unfortunately, and very successfully, the right in Israel try to make the claim, and quite a lot of actually Palestinian supporters helped the right by saying, well, there's no difference between 48 and 67. It's all occupation. And then if that is true, then occupation is insignificant. So the question of significance of occupation has become sort of attacked by both right and left. And I think this is why it is losing its relevance, though I think it's still very, very relevant today.
Thank you. A number of questioners have asked about the state of affairs in the Palestinian world, and particularly about what the path forward is for a Palestinian political leadership that can be effective in representing the interests and aspirations of the Palestinian people. Dalia has alluded to the importance of free and fair democratic elections. Shibley, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what needs to happen on the Palestinian side in order to represent the Palestinian people effectively.
First of all, if you don't mind, I want to go back to the question of occupation because I think it's really important. I think that, look, to say something didn't exist before 1948, Israel didn't exist before 1948. Jordan didn't exist before 1948. Kuwait didn't exist as states. I mean, as independent states. Qatar didn't exist as a state. The existence of states and their legitimacy is really part of the development of the state system under the UN, and what makes them legitimate now and have to be recognized for all people who want to question their history is that they're accepted by the United Nations and the international community as legitimate. The international community very clearly through the United Nations stipulates the West Bank is occupied territory. The very, very basis of legitimacy of Israel in international eyes as a state is also the basis for accepting that the West Bank is occupied territory. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I mean, again, if you start looking to subjective reference points about how we each define ourselves or our histories, or our own narratives, that's just not the way to engage internationally. It's the way to engage internally for sure. I understand that, but that's not a basis of judgment. I don't think there's any question about it. I don't think there's anybody who questions that except a few on the margin in the international community. And the fact that the Israeli debate has moved away from that is part of the problem, I would say. And it has to, obviously reevaluate the way it passes judgment and takes positions. But going back to the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority, look, the Palestinian Authority is a product of the Oslo agreements. It was supposed to be transitional in the hope for developing ultimately a Palestinian state. Obviously, the Oslo agreements have failed and have not been implemented except initially. The Palestinian Authority has no sovereign control. It is essentially under the full control of the state of Israel. Even the Area A under Oslo, where it's supposed to have had control, Israel goes in and out all the time. It is not capable of providing for its citizens even under the best of circumstances because it's not a sovereign state and lacks resources. So it's an artificial entity that happens to, in the meanwhile, provide services to Palestinians while also negotiating with Israel under occupation. So even if you had the best possible Palestinian Authority, the likelihood that the inequality of power between Israel and the Palestinians will be somehow overcome by having a better Palestinian leader is a joke. And frankly, Abu Mazen was, of course, the favor of the Israelis and the Americans early on to replace Arafat because he was anti-violence and was prepared to cooperate. And obviously, look at what happened now. He's on the other side. So, of course, the Palestinians, even under the limited circumstances that they have under occupation, have to be more democratic. They have to have people who can speak for them legitimately, negotiate on their behalf legitimately, provide better services. So this is not to take away from the critics of the authority. The critics of the authority are right. The authority has failed even despite its weak hand, is still failed. And I think that right now, frankly, it's hard to imagine the evolution of a more responsive authority without a legitimate election, which obviously had been postponed. But nonetheless, don't expect much from an election. I repeat that because I think perhaps you might expect that the Palestinians will respond to it more, that it might negotiate from a position of strength, that might provide better services, but it will not in any shape or form overcome the existing inequality of power that is behind the current stalemate.
I want to pick up on a question that was asked about Palestinian citizens of Israel, which also emerged in Yuli's talk when she identified Palestinian citizens of Israel as a major actor of new relevance to the equation. I'm wondering, especially given the violence of May, the protests that seem to tie together Palestinians really for the first time in Gaza, the West Bank, and within Israel. I'm wondering what others think about the role to be played by Palestinian citizens of Israel in sort of altering the existing equation, and whether or not they can be a force, will be a force, can be a force, and if so, in what way? Maybe Dalia?
Sorry, I was just trying to do some additional login stuff, losing battery a little bit. But I think that's a good question. I have to say that I think that I would raise a bit of a question about, how Yuli presented it, because I think it would be wonderful to imagine and actually have the possibility of the Palestinian citizens of Israel being that kind of a bridge. No question that that's desirable, but I think that as a political, again, my hat as a political analyst or strategist now, I think one of the biggest problems that the political community has faced is that if they even mention the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in political contexts, they are, vilified by Israeli society. The only reason we've seen the breakthrough that we've seen was essentially something like a devil's bargain, that Mansour Abbas agreed implicitly or explicitly never to raise the issue as long as he was in government. I mean, I'm kind of reading into the political map. I don't know if that was formally agreed, but that's what he's basically communicated to the Israeli public. That's what he's communicated to his voters. And I think that makes, I think it's unrealistic to imagine that the Palestinian Israeli citizens, their political leaders, can make advancing this issue some sort of central to their agenda without being seen by Israeli Jewish society as illegitimate. That's just what's been happening over the last decade. It's very complicated. And sometimes I wonder if Mansour Abbas, as head of Ra'am inside the coalition, is saying to himself, we're going to take you up on your bluff. We're going to play, I'm sorry to use this term, I'm using it in quotation marks, in Israeli terminology, the good Arab. That's how he's portraying their political program. This is not my term. And see if Israel actually does, is willing to meet their end of the bargain by advancing our interests. And I am concerned that it's not going to pay off. Right now, Ra'am is threatening to leave the coalition as of today, so we'll see what actually happens. I mean, I wish and I believed that could be a role. I just honestly, from the political levels, I'm not sure how it happens because it's always caught in that catch-22 of Israeli society. I would love if the
Can I disagree for a second?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
we have
I also want
we have 1 minute left, so I'm going to give 30 seconds to Yuli and then the final word and maybe an additional question to Omar to wrap up. Go ahead, Yuli. Take a.
No, I think looking only at Abbas is a mistake. There are anchor people on television who are not ashamed to say when the prisoners escaped that they were freedom fighters. The debate in Israeli media, even it shifts, I think, very significantly. There are new voices from within Israel that are redescribing the situation.
Okay, we heard the echo, so we heard you twice. And now we'll shift for our final question, just a very brief 30-second response to Omar. Feel free to weigh in on that, but I'm really interested in asking a question that has come up in the Q&A, which is, and it's a big question that would require another session, but we'll give you 30 seconds for it. What should the United States do? If you were in charge, what would you like to see the United States do to assume an active role in altering the balance of the stasis on the ground?
I'll try to answer that in 5 seconds. If I was the United States, what I would try to do is open its mind up to the reality as it exists on the ground and shape policy oriented towards that reality. Don't get stuck in the path of 20, 30 years ago. You need to open up even if you're not ready to act on that, you need to start shaping policy by recognizing the reality as it exists. I really want to answer the question of Palestinian citizens of Israel, because this is like the huge basis of my work, is the growing centrality of those citizens within the conflict overall. And I agree with Yuli on that, but I took serious issue with the framing, because the Israeli society and the state and the Jewish establishment marginalizes the Palestinian citizens of Israel and alienates them whenever possible. And so it was very jarring for me to hear, that they are the possible bridge and that they are the possible savior of creating some kind of balance with and connection with the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Israel operates from a position of total unilateralism. The keys are in their hands in terms of shaping, where we're headed. So to rely on a community, on a minority within Israel that is marginalized from power, from the political establishment, is quite surprising. I think like even Mansour Abbas, again, and Dalia mentioned this in terms of his position within the government, he doesn't even have a ministry under his thing. We have no idea. I mean, he went in there to try to secure a little bit of a budget for his community. We don't even know if he will get that. But no Palestinian or Arab politician and party within Israeli history has had power within a government to shape policy. And so, until that happens, then it's quite a stretch to believe that they'll have an impact. But they will have an impact on the future, but in a much different way. And that's in the connection with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, separate from their position within Israel as an envoy in that particular way. And that's what we saw in April and May. That's what's happening. And it's happening because of the changing dynamics on the ground related to the impossibility of two states and the marginalization of that community within Israel. And I'll leave it there.
Well, on that important point of divergence, we're going to have to bring this conversation to an end. It's been a really stimulating hour and a half. I want to thank our 4 panelists for joining us and for inaugurating this series. And I now will hand things over to Steve Ross to wrap up.
Thank you, David. I wish to thank all our panelists today, David Myers, Omar Rahman, Dalia Scheindlin, Yuli Tamir, and Shibli Telhami for sharing their ideas with us. And more important than anything else is David and I began this cooperation not with an idea we're going to solve anything, but with an idea that unless we talk about this and get people committed to some kind of just peace who have different points of view, nothing will move forward. And I really appreciate the 4 of you offering, I think today, some ideas that do move us forward. We will resume this again on December 3rd with different panelists, and hopefully perhaps even a 3rd panel at some point. One of the things David and I discussed is we did not want to start off these discussions with people who actually belong to institutions that they have some kind of institutional loyalty, but rather to independent thinkers who are coming in with their ideas, and hopefully it generates ideas we can move on from. Again, I want to thank David and Maya Ferdman at the UCLA Luskin Center. I want to thank Dr. Dov Waxman and the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israeli Studies. And I want to thank my Associate Director, Lisa Ansel, for all their hard work. And I just want to turn this over for one last final comment from David as we conclude today. David.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for being with us. I want to thank our audience for your really outstanding questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. We will have a recording of this session, and we really encourage you to send along your comments and to join us again on December 5th. Thank you all.